everyone. I'm Caroline Sinders, and this is my presentation of AI is More Than Math. And I'm an artist and design researcher. I've been studying how people understand to relate and then create within large systems and platforms like social networks for the past 7 years. Sometimes I look like that when I look at what people say on the internet. And you can laugh, there are some jokes. I promise I won't talk about Coca-Cola at all. I've worked as a UX designer in advertising, a design researcher for IBM Watson, and I've held arts and writing residencies with BuzzFeed, IBM, which is an art and technology center in New York, and Google's PAIR, which is People in the Artificial Intelligence Research Group. And I'm currently a fellow with Harvard University and the Mozilla Foundation exploring what we're calling explainable AI. And I'm pretty narrowly focused on this one goal, which is how can we make, as designers, technologists, creators, and researchers, AI understandable for everyone? How can we have people understand algorithms? And I think it's with really good design. But before we get there, we should probably talk about what is machine learning. And my title is a little bit of a misnomer. Algorithms, AI, and machine learning are math, and it's code. But it's also data sets and intentional design. Algorithms are designed to do things, from translating text into speech, looking at predictions from data, from recognizing and sorting images together. But algorithms are really about how information is processed. Kate Devlin, an AI researcher, in her book defines AI as the concepts of machines being able to carry out tasks in an intelligible manner. At present, though, none of the AI in use today involves machines actually being sentient or being conscious, nor do they have general intelligence. Rather, they use data to understand patterns of outcomes and in that way learn from previous situations. AI, machine learning, and algorithms are really just pattern matching and sorting. Okay, but what really is AI? Mimi Onawa and Mother Cyborg, in their book, The People's Guide to AI, which you should all read and purchase, it's very short and it's very lovely, likens AI to being like salt. AI is not a product, it's not really a feature, it's a transformative ingredient, it's tech. Salt, for example, on its own, it's not a meal, it's not really anything other than a flavor. Is it really that interesting? It's singular. But when combined with other ingredients, it completely changes an entire meal. AI is transformative in product design as well as in everyday life. But AI is also data, and data is as important as the algorithm and the code that's written, because data determines what an algorithm does. Data is used to train an algorithm and machine learning systems. An algorithm that's designed to analyze social media is trained on social media data. So data is incredibly important. And what is data inside of machine learning? It can be language, it can be images, text, output from social media, the kinds of emoji reactions you have to a post, the time you used a GIF, where the GIF came from, the frequency of retweets. It's a lot of things related to SEO and marketing, but it's also human outputs. Any kind of data that exists in the world is created from people and by people. Now, that may seem not quite true, but let's think about it. If you were to look at shipping logistics, where are people in that? It's an entire industry of taking things from one space to another space for people. There's nothing cold and mechanical about data. It's all people, it's all inherently human. So we have to treat data as a sensitive object, as a special kind of precious material. And I want to highlight some really interesting art projects that focus on data and algorithms. One of my favorites is Mimi Onawa's The Library of Missing Data Sets. Missing data sets are blank spots and otherwise data-saturated spaces. The Library of Missing Data Sets, started in 2016, is an ongoing physical repository of these things that have been excluded in a society where so much else is collected. And there are times where we can think of not being seen or captured in data as a good thing. For example, with facial recognition. What happens if facial recognition is extremely accurate? What happens if it recognizes or perceives faces of one skin color better over another? What happens when that's implemented on CCTV cameras? Perhaps it's not good to be seen by a system. But then on the other side, what happens when facial recognition software is deployed at border crossings? What happens if you're not seen? What happens when you're detained at an airport because a facial recognition system cannot recognize your face? Where do you go? I love this other project because it points out the fallibility of algorithms, as did part of the previous example. This is Heather Dewey Hagborg's work, probably Chelsea. What we're looking at are 30 different possible portraits of Chelsea Manning, algorithmically generated by an analysis of her DNA and then 3D printed. None of these are wrong, but Chelsea Manning doesn't look like any of those portraits. And this is using a very standard kind of algorithm that has been vetted and used in a lot of different bioengineering and biotechnical spaces, right? Now, these two projects aren't exactly about AI, but I'm striving to build here an idea around how products and data can work together, and how an algorithm, especially when it learns from human data and changing data, and from data fed daily into products, can fail. And we need to deeply investigate data within these systems. So this is 2 different Google search results. Does anyone know what they could be? This is from an experiment in 2016. That's professional hair. That's unprofessional hair. Now, Google is slightly course-corrected now, and if you were to try to replicate this, you would see a lot more Caucasian hairstyles on unprofessional hair. But it's not quite even. It doesn't quite erase that this existed at some point. Now, is Google search a product? It totally is a product. It's a thing that we use at a lot of different points in our life. But what's important here is this raises questions about the diversity of the data set, as well as the diversity of the engineering team, the QA team, and the design team. How was it rolled out and allowed to get to this point? No one sets out to make a bad product, but it's not a bug, it's a feature until it's fixed. And here's another example. This is called Faceception. It's by an Israeli startup. It's using algorithmic facial detection to detect emotions in faces. Now, what's the problem with this beyond the surveillance aspect? How many of you have heard of resting bitch face? One of my best friends has that, and she also suffers from what I call resting bitch voice. So when I text her, it's a lot of exclamation points, like, oh, I'm coming back into town. And then she'll say, if I were to run into her, I've missed you so much. But over text, there's lots of emojis. She's very expressive in text message. Or let's go a little step further. How many of you have ever smiled or laughed to diffuse an uncomfortable situation? Probably a lot of different people in this room, especially women and other marginalized groups. Are we ever really emoting ourselves fully, truly, 100% of the time? And do we express emotion in the same way? Is emotion expressed differently culture to culture? It probably is. So we can think about how this could be so incorrectly made. And then what is the intention or the use case of rolling this out? Do I smile all the time when I'm happy? No. Sometimes I don't smile at all when I'm incredibly happy. Should we have a data set of true emotional, resonance in our faces? Should it exist? Should it be deployed? Bad AI isn't just algorithms being broken, it's understanding the nuances really between what's in your data set, what is your data set, how you unintentionally entrain that algorithm, how it affects a product, and how it harms your users. And I think that there are some solutions in this space that we can look at and try to implement. We could apply what I like to call an open source mentality to AI. What do I mean by this? Well, how do we make AI more accessible? For example, like code releases that are open to external audits, or like data sets that the public can dig into and actually see, or like explanations that explain how an algorithm is interacting with a product, or rather, how it's interacting with data. How old is the algorithm that your product is using? Who made it? Where did it come from? When was it last updated? These are all different kinds of things we can do to start explaining what AI is, especially inside of consumer products. And this is where I think, again, data is so important, and I want to highlight a project that I really love, and I'm not just saying this because I'm a fellow with Mozilla, but I really love the Mozilla project called Common Voice. Common Voice is an open source data set created by the Mozilla Foundation. Common Voice is one of the largest public domain transcribed voice data sets ever made. It's a community collaboration effort. People volunteer and record their voices. And it's really big. It has more than 1,400 hours of voice data with 18 languages represented. Now, why do we need an open source voice data set of this size? Because voice-to-text automation is the frontier of creating more accessible products. This is AI trying to help in disability spaces. Common Voice supports multiple languages, which means that it has the ability to understand and support multiple dialects and accents. That's something that Siri doesn't do quite so well with. But anyone, any company can use Common Voice. How about that? I want to highlight an art project of mine. It's an open source project in the making called Feminist Dataset. And I had this idea when I was focusing mainly on, in my research, looking at toxicity in language and algorithms. I study online harassment in the alt-right in addition to ethics and AI, which means I look at a lot of traumatic data. I look at a lot of traumatic neo-Nazi-focused data across Discord, Twitter, Facebook, 4chan, 8chan, and Reddit. And I've created different kinds of ways to show the data that I'm collecting, from making a hate speech dictionary that's currently used by the Southern Poverty Law Center, as well as an article for courts outlining that there is an alt-right version of everything. But I wanted to make something to counteract this hate speech I was studying. I wanted to make something, perhaps data that could help try to fight inequity, hence this idea of the Feminist Dataset. Feminist Dataset is a multi-year-long project collecting and archiving feminist works, be it song lyrics, podcast transcripts, interviews, essays, blog posts, all of which will be put into a public repository that's effectively an archive. And then I'm going to use it to try to imagine what a feminist chat interface could look like, as well as a data set with natural language processing. It's my way of trying to intervene in AI. It's my way of creating and protesting with data. The Feminist Dataset offers a new way, looking at intersectional feminism, to outline how we can think about data sets and data collection, especially as we view this as a space for data interrogation, as well as how a community can be involved in creating a collaborative data set. This is an image from Feminist Dataset being installed at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I think this sort of fits into a bigger part of my own design methodology, which I'm calling human rights-centered design. I think we need a new framework for creating with AI, one that goes beyond data accountability and creation. We need human rights-centered design. Human rights-centered design is inspired by the United Nations International Declarations on Human Rights Framework, which outlines basic inalienable rights afforded to all people. It's about sovereignty for the individual and equity. I want to argue that sovereignty and dignity is user agency, especially in relationship to data ownership when enacted in technology and design. We aren't giving consumers any ways to opt out, to change, or to adjust how algorithms affect them within a product. We aren't asking them to say yes, and we definitely aren't letting them say no. We aren't giving users ways to remove their data from a data model. We need to start designing for transparency. This is my project at Mozilla for the next year, which is inspired by two other design manifestos, the Secure UX Checklist and the Consensual Software Manifesto, which all of you should definitely check out. My project outlines 3 principles for designing for transparency and machine learning: legibility, the ability to audit, creating spaces for impact and interaction, and using design to explain what's actually happening inside of an algorithm, a data model, and a product. Legibility is inspired by 18F's Plain Language Guide to Designing for the Federal Government and for Civil Servants. Legibility is explaining, in plain language, what a product and algorithm is doing. Legibility can be showing or explaining what's in a data set. I call this data ingredients. Should data sets have ratings, explanations, and readable labels? Should they have something that looks like this? Drugs in the United States have approval processes. They are tested. Food has ingredients and caloric information listed. While this idea isn't perfect, we should start thinking about ratings, or at least labels, and accountability for data. What if algorithms came with this kind of labeling? If you think that this is a good idea, you're not the only one. A similar methodology has been proposed by Kate Crawford and a group of collaborators in a paper called Data Sheets. Is this our data future? It could be. Does this need a real graphic designer? Sure as hell does. Because I made this and I am definitely not a graphic designer. Okay, so what is transparency in action? Let's imagine this framework more in action. And let me tell you an adjacent, funny side story. A boy who is super awful but had the hair of a Disney prince broke my heart a couple years ago. And I'm sure some of you've done, I drowned myself in music. And my Spotify drug of choice was Mumford & Sons. And I don't even really like that band. But when I was heartbroken, I loved that band. Like, every damn day, listened to that band all day long. And you know what I did? I like super fucked up my Discover Weekly. I personally destroyed my own Discover Weekly. It was my fault. And this was 4 years ago. And I still get recommendations for alt folk rock to this day. And this is like a really funny and really innocuous like story, but it's important to bring up because I use Spotify every day. I read to music, I write to music, I code to music, I walk to music, I fall asleep to music. I'm sure a lot of you listen to music. But why can't I make my Discover Weekly forget? Why can't I, as a user, suggest what I'm actually interested in? Because it's a big part of my life. If an algorithm is looking for user flags and cues, some of those cues may not actually be good at all. Some of those flags may be an accident or a month of Mumford & Sons you wish you could forget. So what you see here is a suggestion I made for Harvard's Shorenstein Center, it's a Center for Journalists Working with Technology, on a piece that they're doing called Privacy by Design. It pulls from my Designing for Transparency methodology because I was trying to imagine a way to create for spaces of user intervention, as well as trying to actually explain potentially how the algorithm was created. How old is the Discover Weekly algorithm? What data was it trained on? Has it been encapsulated or wrapped? Is it stopped? Does it still learn from my data? Is there a way that I can suggest or elevate more important data, right? Sometimes an algorithm is looking for cues to suggest recommendations based off similar things. How can I try to change or intervene in this space? And I think by allowing for that kind of user intervention and readability, it embodies a human rights-centered design mindset. So human rights-centered design is, well, it puts user agency first by always focusing on consent. Everything should have a way for a user to say yes or no. Human rights-centered design is data protection first, recognizing data is human inherently and always. This methodology doesn't design with opt-out only in mind. Human rights-centered design is participatory by nature. It designs for the global south first, centering a diversity of experiences, and understands that localization is different than translation. That language and access is key, and design is integral in that conversation. It actively asks what could possibly go wrong in a product for all the shades of the problem, from the benign to the most extreme. And then it plans for those use cases because it views use cases not as edge cases. Human-centered design knows that a bug is a feature until you fix it. Which brings us to what are design-based human rights violations? And I have two examples. One is extreme and one is a bit more, again, benign. But nonetheless, we should have human rights-centered design violations, and we should view these as human rights violations. And the more extreme one, and it's one I think about a lot, is the systems and protocols for content moderators. The tools and policies and time limits, in addition to the content moderators are forced to look at, and the systems they are forced to work within are human rights violations. Most content moderators have under a handful of seconds to make a decision, looking at some of the most gruesome, violent, traumatic, and upsetting content, posts, and images, all while having to memorize specific policy combinations and specific trainings from a variety of different platforms. It's important that we see this problem in its entirety, and also as a human rights violation, as many content moderators suffer from stress and post-traumatic stress disorder from their daily jobs. Okay, so what's a more benign one, though? Now, bear with me, because this probably makes me sound like a crazy person, but I think location services automatically turned on platforms is a human rights violation. And my reasoning behind this is, does it endanger sovereignty? Well, when you're designing, ask, Who does it serve and who does it harm? Does it deploy dignity? We can have an opt-out for location services in the design, or sorry, rather we can have an opt-in by turning it off. And if someone wants to add a location, they can just add it. And users should be able to choose really any location individually, but not automatically on posts and images. And it can be really silly. Maybe I want to say I'm in the woods in Moose Jaw, Canada, which is a very real place I want to visit. When does it harm, though, when my location services are revealed? Well, ask any victim of domestic violence, ask any victim of online harassment, ask any marginalized person who's faced death threats. Does Instagram really need my real locations? Does Apple? Human rights-centered design is advocacy and usability in conversation with design. And I think we can make better things if we start to focus on this. It's policy, design, and code, and it's user sovereignty. And surprise, this was a talk about design ethics. I want to thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Thank you. Thank you.
So, how do we begin to interrogate these data sets and algorithms when everyone who owns them says that they're proprietary?
I mean, I feel like we can look at other industries in this sort of space, or rather in like the automation space. So we have certain kinds of regulations, and I also want to take a step back and say, I'm not saying regulation is the initial answer, but does BMW let its electric engine be open to audit, right? Is it open to a specific set of auditors? Would we let that car sort of go on the road without like letting that be examined or explored more? Probably not, right? So I think it's important to sort of highlight that. There are spaces where proprietary ingredients or a proprietariness to a design is recognized, but it's still open to audits. It's still open to safety regulations and to checks. And I think we can pull from other areas of automation, engineering, and other aspects of design to sort of bolster this argument.
I mean, you mentioned like nutrition labels, for example, which like most of the only sort of protected thing is like the secret formula, but they do list the ingredients.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they also tell you when it expires.
Right.
And they tell you like when you should go buy a new one.
Right.
And, crazy.
So one of the things I'm really intrigued by is like these devices, they're so far ahead of regulation and even public thought, like they're supposed to anticipate needs. So like regulators or people thinking about policy get them afterwards. So like somebody who's like the designer of a body camera for a police officer, the designer is the person who's determining, does that start recording before the cop presses the button? Does it upload every 20 seconds or every 10 seconds? And that has real policy implications and real criminal justice implications. So like, how do you sort of get designers to think about this stuff, like ahead of time and, think about the public good ahead of time?
I think we need to think of domain expertise in policy as a part of like our T-shaped diagram for what makes a good designer or a good sort of creator out in the world. Like my T-shapedness is like having a specific understanding of policy and regulation and how that is then deployed into technology and design. So I would say, and this is especially true of social networks, if you're going to work at a social network, you should have a deep, deep understanding of like the history of the internet, but also in cases of history of internet online harassment. Can there be some kind of boot camp for hate speech laws and crimes, for example? We need to stop viewing these things as just like outside expertise or that like policy will handle this and a designer's just going to design. Because it's true, when you look at something like things being left to opt out or like the fact that you can't mute or block people on Slack. You can't. Or that you have no privacy settings in any of your Facebook Messenger. In Facebook Messenger, it's treated as a different area inside of Facebook. So if someone knows your name, they can message you on Facebook Messenger. It doesn't replicate your actual profile settings. Someone made those decisions. And those decisions are things we have to hold companies accountable for and also culpable for. And as they start to roll out their own measures to add in transparency, I think this is where the role of design is so incredibly important. We can have opinions on what design standards are for these kinds of things. What are design standards for transparency? It can't just be releasing code, right? If we look at Facebook's ad tracking that they started to open up their API, is it easy to use for a researcher, for anyone in this room? If the answer is you just need to actually write lines of code, that's not accessible. That's not useful. So I think we have to start thinking about it from, I guess, this kind of perspective.
And so you mentioned the sort of the emotional, mental toll of taking in all the hate speech and the images from these horrible places. And so one of the solutions is to have machines, algorithms do that for us. And so what are the pitfalls of that?
That's funny because this is something that was brought up today in one of the round tables. I mean, one of the pitfalls is like, we don't know the auditing system that Facebook has, or rather, we don't know their pipeline from content sent to a content moderator and where it goes afterwards. Like, is it a circular one? Is there a conversation that happens? And by I say we, I have seen some of it, and I've signed an NDA. Whoops. But it's not as symbiotic as you think it would be. And so inside of this, if we're going to start thinking of automation, we have to improve the pipeline of what content moderation reporting looks like. We also then need to have there be levels of accountability inside of Facebook for being up to date on new hate speech terms and like hate speech trends, right? In all different countries. And then from there, it's like, okay, then breaking it down into what does hate speech look like? Well, it can be specific insignias. It can be specific slang words. It can be memes, right? It's all these different things. And they change group to group to group. And
they constantly change.
They're constantly changing,
I mean,
right?
they're a cartoon frog, or they're, I mean, like, and it's constantly changing.
Constantly changing.
And so that's the expiration date is sort of an interesting aspect to this, and the constant evolution.
Totally. So I'm not sure if like automation will be necessarily one of the solutions. I think that there are spaces to fit automation into this pipeline, but you need a lot of people along the way. For example, an idea I've had and I've put into other talks is, could you use machine learning to analyze unknown new words in relationship to hate speech words? Is this a better way to catch emerging memes, right? So there is like this project called Project Gutenberg, which outlines and maps a lot of the English language. So you could have a hate speech dictionary, which I've tried to build, and have this combined with Project Gutenberg. Could you then start to analyze new words that are popping up and remove like the misspellings of words? You would need this information fed back to a person to check, to do any kind of ethnographic checking, right? Probably reach out to different NGOs to then have them also confirm. That's not a fast pipeline, and that's not an answer that tech companies want. But I think that is the actual answer. That's the human rights answer, which is sometimes you have to move slowly. Sometimes things don't scale the way you think that they should. And I think that's kind of like the deadly problem with social networks is scale means large and fast.
To move fast, break shit.
Yeah. I say like move slowly, be nice to people.
I like that policy better. Caroline Sinders, everybody.
Thank you.